So I feel like I've done a lot of talking about, like what makes a game bad, and the behaviors that game developers engage in that result in bad games. I think it's a good idea to talk about what makes a good game, though. Like, it can't just be all negative, right? You can't just be that asshole yelling into the wind, farting into the wind, rather. What makes a game a good game? And I kind of touched on this a little bit. I think I really loosely define, and not even a good game. Let's just say, what makes a game? Because good, bad, that's all subjective, right? That is your opinion, whether it's good or bad. I like different games than the next person's going to like, right? So, what just makes a game? And I kind of loosely define that as being a challenge. Like, it's got to be a challenge. There has to be something to overcome. But then there has to be a level of freedom. And that's because if there's a challenge but no freedom, it's tedious. Then it's just trying to figure out the right set of button presses that get you to where you need to be. And that's not really a challenge. That's, it's tedium. If there's lots of freedom, but there's no challenge, or even a self-imposed challenge, or if there's no difficulty, rather. I guess challenge, I'll kind of define that as I go. But if there's freedom but no challenge, then it's just boring. Because what's the point? So just to kind of, I'm trying to think of good examples of both of those. So the current state of World of Warcraft would be a good example of the latter. Lots of freedom. You can do all kinds of shit. But there's not really any challenge, and the game is flat and boring because of it. And that's like the main complaint is people are kind of going, well, what's the point? Why am I here? I'm doing nothing playing the game. An example of a game that has challenge but no freedom, that one's a little more difficult to nail down. I think that's because it's more immediately wrong. It's less appealing to more people, I think, as well. Lots of freedom with little to do that's appealing to a lot of people, actually, especially people that aren't gamers, because that's just, if you're just looking to kill time and kind of dick around, having lots of freedom with nothing to do is kind of in and of itself something to do, but there's no challenge, so it's not a game, it's just an activity. And that brings us back to my comparison of the current state of World of Warcraft to an idle RPG game. It's, an idle RPG clicker. Like, there's still, there's something to do, but there's not a lot. And actually, that's actually kind of a good example of some of those games that have a challenge but no freedom. And that is a lot of those idle RPG clickers, which is ironic because they start as one, end as the other. Because as they progress, there's pretty much a very clear-cut path of what it is that you need to do. You need to purchase these upgrades for the game in order to progress forward. But then there becomes no other real viable option except to tediously sit there and click it. And, it's some of them, it's like in the scope of billions of clicks just to get the one upgrade, and you need 100 of them. So that becomes tedium. The game has no challenge. This is also a general lack of freedom and challenge, but the challenge of purchase the upgrades is what you have to do. That's what you have to figure out, but there's no freedom to do so. Well, you can pay money, and that's a whole, I've kind of bitched about that to begin with. But as far as actual in-game activity, it's just the tedium. It's just that task at hand. That's all you can do. And that gets very boring and tedious very quickly. And I think it's worth discussing how the negative impact of these two kind of situations, these non-game situations, either tedious or boring, and they're both boring. Like, that's at the end of the day, that's the real killer, because there's games that aren't boring but are tedious, but they don't ever get boring. The Souls games are a good example of this. Dark Souls, Bloodborne, all of them are like, they're the definition of tedium almost. But they're tedious with enough freedom. I think that's important. That's where that line is, because if there's no freedom, it's just straight tedium, which is terrible. It's actively unfun. Tedium In the sense, because there is, Dark Souls games are very patternistic, and anybody that's decent at the games will tell you they're really not that hard. It's just about recognizing the pattern of the boss and then how to overcome that. And basically, you match their pattern with your own pattern, and you win. And they say it's easy because of that. There actually isn't that much challenge. It's just the initial pattern recognition of that fact. I think the one aspect, though, is there is enough freedom in the game, because one of the things you can do is just straight out level it. Because there are leveling mechanics within Soulsborne games that allow you to basically grind and overgear and over-level the challenge, and then just kind of just plow right through it. Or there's, certain items that you can equip and pick up that allow you to pull off certain things that make you, kind of make up for a lack of skill. So that's a good definition of, or example rather, of a game that has some tedium in some challenge, but enough freedom that keeps things interesting. And then combine that with, there's the world building and all that, but really that doesn't even matter. You could make a good game without good graphics, without a story. Mario has basically no fucking story, and the Mario games are considered to be good games because there's enough of a challenge. You got to get to the end of the platforming level. But there's enough freedom because there's multiple ways around it. Do you stomp the Goomba? Do you avoid the Goomba? Do you pick up the Fire Flower? Do you pick up the Superstar? There's a lot of options on how it is that you achieve the goal of getting to the end of the level. But there's no storytelling, there's no graphics. The music's pretty good, all things considered. I think that's one of the things Nintendo really deserves a lot of credit for. And music actually, I think, plays a bigger part in games than a lot of people realize. And I think music's actually more important than people realize, even more so than graphics probably. Because graphics you can kind of explain away, but music gets grating quickly if it's not done right, or gets annoying quickly if it's not done right. And Nintendo always gets credit because it's the technicality of what they had to work with as far as system limitations and how they pulled off, some of the tracks that they did. It's really, really impressive if you look into it. There's people that, have much better, videos and could break this down than I ever could. And I recommend looking them up because it's really interesting how Nintendo pulled it off with, it's something like they had 3 notes to work with and that was it. And somehow they made it, into these, iconic songs. So speaking of older kind of, especially Nintendo, because I think Nintendo, if you look at, Nintendo's kind of like ruling the roost right now as far as like game development goes. You look at if you look at lists of like the best games of 2018, it's all Nintendo. And I think I mentioned this before, and I think it's because Nintendo makes games to be fun. Their games have enough challenge that it keeps you interested, and enough freedom that they're fun, that it's interesting to overcome the challenge. Like it sounds like I'm repeating myself a lot, but I feel like if you really pay attention, I'm not. So I think a really good example of just a well-made game, and a game that's good in kind of the most basic definition, is the Pokemon games. And so why are the Pokemon games good? And that's because there is a challenge. And the challenge is very clearly defined by, I remember, because the Pokemon games went very much hand in hand with both the TCG and the cartoon. When I was a kid growing up, all 3 were very much intermarried. You weren't exposed to one without being exposed to the other. And I think part of what really made Pokemon such a phenomenon was that, so what's the goal of a Pokemon game? And it's right there in the theme song of the TV show, and that was to be the very best, like no one else was before. So that's kind of, and that is, it's explained, and that's kind of put in the game as well, that your job is to become a Pokemon master. That's usually, like, in the opening, scene, they're not really cutscenes in a Pokemon game, but kind of the opening dialogue of the game is to be, it defines your journey as being that of one to become a Pokemon master, to catch all the Pokemon, to defeat the Elite. And because you're actually, no, not even delete the Elite Four, because you're not even made aware of their existence until farther into the game. But it's kind of loosely defined as to become a Pokemon master. What does that mean? That's up to you. Maybe it is defeat the Elite Four. Maybe it is collect one of each kind of Pokemon. Maybe it's collect 2 because you're playing one of the later generations that have breeding in it. But it's the goal of the game is somewhat open-ended. It's somewhat undefined. So, that's a very good thing because it leaves the idea of the game up to the player. So that's the freedom. You have the freedom of choice. How do you play Pokemon? Now, it's however you want to play. Do you play it slow and steady, catching every single Pokemon that you come across? Or do you play, kind of quick and dirty, where you're pulling out guides, and because I remember, who remembers those big fucking phone books that used to be like the companion guide to the games that had the stickers in the back that you put on the pages? It was fucking awesome. I miss being a kid. Like, that's one of my best memories of being a kid, was the Pokemon Game Boy games on that shitty little screen with no color, and that big ass tome phone book thing that you'd pick the stickers out of the back page, and then you'd put the sticker whenever you capture one of the Pokemon on its page. It was wonderful. Just the tactile sense, the involvement, the sense of a progression and achievement of doing something. That was great. And that was really, I think, why Pokemon became, that kind of shit was why Pokemon became such a big thing, is because there was so much involved with it, and it was so open-ended. Were you a collector? Were you a defeater? Did you go through, find the best stats and build the best team, level them all up as much as possible, and then bulldoze every opponent? Or did you, were you a slow collector? Were you a trader? Were you the guy that went and found the rare Pokemon, and then you go trade them with your friends via the link cable, and then that's how you build? Like, there were so many ways to play the game. And so what was the challenge? The challenge was up for you to decide. But even then, there were a finite number of challenges, and then how you got there was still up for you to decide. But that said, the game wasn't hard. Now, there was challenges, and there's a very, and even in like, so let's just limit it to the first generation, because that's what I know the best. So if it is limited to the first generation, there was a slightly more complex rock, paper, scissors meta of, fire is, weak to water but strong against grass, and grass is strong, and so that was kind of, it was kind of matching the strengths and the weaknesses. That was about as complex as the game got, and then it just became strictly numerical, whose level was higher. And there was some challenge within the game, but I mean, the Pokemon only have 4 moves. Each monster only had 4 moves, so there was only so much room for, creative gameplay. A lot of it was just use the ability again. But a lot of it was, so where a lot of the challenge actually came from was the team management. Like, the actual battling was fucking stupid. It was pointless. What the game really was balancing your team, making sure you had the right combination of different Pokemon that all had the same subtypes, so that you could counter any challenge that came up. So if somebody came at you with a ground type, you had the counter for that. If somebody came in with a psychic type, you had the counter for that. And being able to adjust on the fly. That was really what the Pokemon games were about. They were about management, not about the actual action in the battling. That was simply a mechanism by which your management was measured. So, what the goal of the game was up to you. How you achieve that goal was up to you. But there still was a very clear and very simple challenge involved of you must manage your team correctly so that you can overcome the different parts of the rock, paper, scissors meta. And so, on top of that, there was also, and I think and this isn't necessarily, but I think it really is. Yeah, I'll say it is I think to go along with the freedom aspect, there shouldn't just be a matter of the freedom of how one achieves the goal. There has to be exploration of some kind. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be in the most literal sense, like, say, Scrolls game, where you're actually exploring, you're exploring physical places. Well, I mean, they're digital, but you know what I mean. You're exploring physical places. You're going into the wilderness and in the caves and shit. It doesn't even need to be that. It could simply be, exploring different mechanics in the game, how different things interact. And I'm trying to think, I know I can think of a good example of that. Well, actually, to go to a game I've talked about before, Path of Exile kind of has that. It's an action RPG. There's not a lot of exploring to be done. The levels are randomly generated, and you're just trying to find you're starting at point A, trying to find point B, and kill the fuck out of everything in between you and point B. There are no secrets. There are no side rooms. But with Path of Exile, one of the things that you kind of explore isn't the game world itself in the literal definition, but you're exploring how the skills interact. Because with Path of Exile, it has a very interesting take on skills and spells, and that they can all be modified, in I'm not going to say a million different ways, but in a fucking lot of different ways by the support gem system. And so some of it's finding out, what support gem supports what spell and what the fuck does it end up doing afterwards. And then you can build a whole fucking, system around that because, oh shit, this works out really well. I didn't expect this and this together to do that. And so there's this aspect of exploring, that's actually, to me, that's the most fun of that game. I don't like Endgame Path of Exile because then to me it starts to get tedious because they do somewhat railroad you towards the end via the learning, not even a learning curve, it's just kind of the difficulty curve after about Act 5. In between Act 5 and 6, the difficulty curve ramps way up as a method of kind of gatekeeping to make sure that, what it does is it makes sure that you're playing the game well. It borderlines on playing the game they want you to play it, which that goes back into tedium because your freedom becomes somewhat limited because there are certain choices in the game you have to make. Path of Exile has a gating mechanic wherein as the game progresses, your resistances to lightning, ice, and fire naturally go down. I think it's a big drop between Act 5 and 6. I think it may drop steadily as you progress through each act, and they do this as kind of a counter to power creep. But what it does mean is that if you haven't actively sought out ways to mitigate this through talents and gear that in cases drastically increase your resistances, you're going to get fucked. So you do somewhat have to play the game the way they want you to play it, or you're just going to lose. You're going to get to a point where you die faster than you can kill what's killing you. That said, the game is still fun, and it also does kind of bring you to... it has that freedom of how you play it. And this is something World of Warcraft had for a while. Because, like me, I like playing Path of Exile to play around with the different combinations of abilities. So the end game's not really my cup of tea because it's action RPG, grindy, repetitiveness anyway, so it's not something I would really want to do. We were kind of doing the same thing over and over again, hoping for a different result, slowly driving yourself crazy, except that one time you did get something dinner, you got the thing that you wanted, and all of a sudden it was worth it. And for some people, that's a lot of fun. For me, it's not. But I do really enjoy, I can play the game over and over again because how you play the game changes so drastically when you pick a different class, pick a different ability, and then pick a different support skills. And so that plays into this concept of exploration, whether it's exploration of the game world, exploration of the game's mechanics, exploration of the game's functions. There has to be exploration. There has to be something for you to discover. And even that, in and of itself, that exploration and discovery, that can drive a game almost on its own, which is interesting now that I think about it, because I can't say that about the other two. There isn't such a thing as so much freedom in the game. Well, I guess that's not true, though, because Minecraft was ostensibly a game where you had all the freedom in the world, but I guess there still was a challenge in Minecraft, because there was challenges proposed by the limitations of the system. So even if you played Minecraft in creative, you would set forth yourself a challenge, and it's a sandbox game, so what the challenges were more self-defined, but they were still there because I guess it depends, because you could play Minecraft and be like, it's just big painting, and that would be it. And I guess the challenge is, coming up with the right palette and the textures and how to use the certain blocks to create that which it is that you're trying to, bring to life. So I guess that's true. So you could have enough freedom to, but there still requires, the challenge. If Minecraft was just, I don't know. I feel like the challenge is still there. It's not just, the freedom is, if Minecraft really is kind of the main showcase, but that even that freedom, you're still having to, when people make these giant, I've seen people paint pictures in Minecraft, photorealistic, because they're basically using each block as a pixel and they add enough blocks across. The definition when you zoom all the way back is high enough that it looks like a picture. But even then, it's finding, the challenge becomes using the palettes that you have, because people, the challenge for a lot of this would be people would do this in vanilla Minecraft with no texture packs. So, using this brownish block versus this other brownish block, and then figuring out how they relate to what the picture should look like, and so that becomes the challenge. So there's still challenge, but I think discovery on its own, you can have a game that's got no fucking challenge, no freedom, but there's just enough shit to discover And I guess discovery and freedom are somewhat linked, but I feel like freedom is more about the gameplay, where discovery is more kind of a general concept of how would you define the two? Freedom is definitely more about the gameplay. Freedom is how it is that you beat the challenge. I guess that's the relationship, is that freedom and the challenge and the freedom are directly related, where discovery is more of an aside. It's something that exists outside of those two, but not necessarily separate from those two. And I think that's why there's mobile games that I've downloaded before that have no substance. There's no game, there's no freedom, there's no nothing. But there's, for some reason, what they did add in, there's no challenge, there's no real freedom, because there's nothing to do, because there's no challenge. So how do you have freedom when there's no challenge? But what they did do was they added in these weird concepts of discovery, and to the point where the discovery almost becomes the game, because the actual game on its head, and I'm trying to think, what was it called? Realm Grinder, I think, was the name of the game. And on its face, it's a very, very boring, average RPG clicker game. With very, they're not even retro graphics, they're just shitty pixel graphics. And it's just one of those things, at first it's just the Skinner box of, tap, 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 build, tap, 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 build, get better, build more, build more, build more, stagnate, and then you prestige. But then they start to reveal that there's things to be discovered as you prestige. Playing the game in a certain way actually brings... So the actual goal of the game is simply to build, as much of... It's like most clicker games, there actually isn't a goal. It's just buy all the shit, except the shit is literally exponential. But then these discoveries, these achievements almost, they end up being the actual game. Now, in this game, Realm Grinder, that was more the point. The game was actually designed and built around this concept of discovering all these achievements.